Hope you had a great time in the barbecue. I was schwitzing preparing, but I hope you were enjoying. I'm allowed to eat afterwards. Those are the rules. I want to thank the sponsors for tonight, Alan Burke, Mark Seidelman, David Tendler, Robert Wallace, and some others. We appreciate your generosity in enabling this evening. I also made an announcement before that I'm going to try to send a weekly WhatsApp group. Now that I'm announcing, I really better stick with it for a bit. A weekly WhatsApp Torah message. So if you're interested, you should sign up. If you didn't find the sign-up sheet, please email me at rabbiflatto@pesyn.org, or if you don't remember, call the shul office. But if you want to join, please join and add your phone number so we could study Torah together in numerous ways. That's our goal here, and to grow together spiritually. In the year 1964, the famed British professor of jurisprudence, H.L.A. Hart from Oxford University, came to Jerusalem to give a series of lectures at the Hebrew University, and it caused a buzz on campus. All the brilliant legal minds, including a youthful Aaron Barak, who was a professor at the time at Hebrew University, were excited to meet H.L.A. Hart in person and to learn from him. And Hart gave 3 lectures. The first 2 were intricate points in legal philosophy, criminal law, legal theory. And then he gave a 3rd lecture. And he struggled his way through the 3rd lecture. The reason why was, rather than just having the group of academics who showed up for the first 2 lectures, this one, for some inexplicable reason, attracted people from Jerusalem, popular audience, women with hair covers, men with kippahs and beards, and they packed the room. And Hart did not know how to speak at once about abstruse legal philosophy issues, but also connect with a wider audience. And he walked out deflated, feeling like he let everybody down. But on his way out, he caught a glimpse of the sign of the title of the lecture. The title he had given is Contemporary British Philosophy and Jurisprudence. But rather than that title, he read on the sign, Contemporary British Philosophy and Jewish Prudence. All the Yidden of Yerushalayim were curious, what does this British brilliant man have to say about Jewish prudence? This is a true story. It's in the biography of H.L.A. Hart. You could almost imagine how the mistake happened. The secretary at Hebrew U said, Maze jurisprudence. And then they said, no, Jewish prudence. And that was the sign. But beyond the cute little story, I'd like to submit that it signifies a deep point, an important point, and that is that much of Jewish prudence, Jewish wisdom, is indeed around jurisprudence. Jewish wisdom is around law and revolves around law. Think about the Torah's grand narrative culminates in Sinai, where God reveals God to humanity one time through the media of law. And we know that the Torah is chock-filled with laws. Judaism is famous for being the religion of laws, which distinguishes Judaism from probably all other religions. In our prayers daily, 3 times a day, we pray not just about temple and forgiveness, but about a legal system, that God should restore the legal system in Jerusalem to all its grandeur. And I would suggest that what's going on in Israel, while it has a lot of depressing and challenging elements, at its core captures something profound and moving and compelling about the Jewish people. Which other people care so much about their legal system? Not just judges, not just law professors, not just lawyers. In Pakistan, there was a revolution involving lawyers. No, this is the citizens who are out there in the streets week after week because they care about the role of law in their beloved country And how will it be organized? And who will be the judges? And what will be the scope of the power of the court? This is inspiring, I think, not just for us Jews, for the world, for all people of the world. I recently returned with my wife, Yael, who is here in the room, and our baby daughter, from a trip to Vilna. Sure, you could applaud. That's much more worthy of applause than for me. From a trip to Vilna, which I hope I get to speak about. But we then spent a few days, even more up north in the Baltics, in Tallinn. And in Tallinn, a beautiful medieval city with only a small Jewish population, even up until the Holocaust. But if you look in the town hall of Tallinn, you have a beautiful building which was the center of the town politically, but also the place where they administered the courts. And they have a few tapestries, and here we have one tapestry in Tallinn, in the Baltics, in the north, 2-hour ferry ride from Helsinki. And who do they look to for an example for justice? They look to King Solomon, and they look to the biblical tradition as the beacon for what it means to be committed to the rule of law. So this is true of the Jewish people and has inspired, I think, notions of justice throughout the world. In case you've been hiding in or hibernating, maybe you missed one of the major plots of 2023. And that is one taking place in Israel, but reverberating around the world, involving a series of judicial reforms introduced in early January when the new government was installed, led by Bibi Netanyahu, with a 64-member coalition described by many as the most right-wing government in the history of Israel. And this new government came out with a clear agenda to reform the judiciary. And I guess to its credit, they did not hide the agenda, but rolled it out in full force early on, January 4th. And we'll get to some of the details of what their judicial reform that they were introducing. Here we have Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, and near him, MK Simcha Rothman, a rather young politician who's become well-known because of the way together, they and their coalition are trying to transform Israel. This engendered a strong reaction, a strong response that I don't think anybody expected. Here you see members of Tel Aviv. In case you don't know anybody from Tel Aviv, they are not shy, and let you know what they think. And here they come out right away on Saturday night, roll into the streets, and by week number 3 or number 4, the crowds grow. Here they tell you what many of them think about Bibi Netanyahu. Maybe it's an odd idea to have a leader who's under indictment. Very odd to us. We don't know of such things here in the US. And here you see the crowds grow. In Tel Aviv, in Kaplan Street, every Saturday night, over 30 weeks in a row, you have crowds of over 100,000 getting more militant, getting more, invested and passionate. And in Jerusalem, you could see the tone is a little different, a little less rowdy, a little less boisterous. But those who oppose the reform now have a Saturday night activity. Actually, in Tel Aviv, they always had a Saturday night activity, but before they go out to the restaurants and to hear music, they first have to stop in Kaplan Street for a rally. In Jerusalem, on the other hand, they actually have to leave their apartments on Saturday night. And that's what they do to go to these rallies week after week. Those are the opponents to the reform. Of course, there are many people who support the reform, and they've also had occasional rallies. Things have gotten more and more intense over the 8 months. And what began as sort of a novelty has turned into a full-blown crisis. President Herzog has talked about the possibility, God forbid, of civil war. think about Israel being 75 years old. And here in America, we know all too well the challenges that a republic could face some 80 or so years into its lifetime. So Israel does not want to descend, God forbid, into that type of chaos or internal crisis. And Herzog, of all the politicians, has tried to be a moral voice, urging, coaxing the different sides to try to find a compromise, to try to speak one another and find a middle road. And I, like all lovers of Zion and all who care about Israel, have been gripped by what's going on in Israel. I guess I have a little more stake in the game because of my legal background and my connection to Israel, but I know everybody has been following. And that has been my role. And then, to my own surprise, I got slightly more involved in one way that I thought would be interesting to share with everybody. President Herzog gave a speech and the speech was at a graduation in Bar Ilan. This is at the end of June. And the subject matter of the speech was talking about the importance of the judiciary and of the courts in Israel, and explaining that its centrality is not only a democratic value, but also a Jewish value, a quintessentially Jewish value. And he proceeded to try to support his argument.
שמה שלא תמיד יודעים זה שהדמוקרטיות המערביות המתקדמות עומדות, ניצבות על ירושלים, על יסודות התנ"ך, המשנה, התלמוד והמסורת הפוליטית היהודית, לא פחות ואולי אף יותר מאשר על תרבות יוון, מאשר על אתונה. חוקרים בעלי שם כמייקל ולצר וסטוארט כהן הדגישו את יצירת האדם בצלם כיסוד שביסס את חירות האדם ומעמדו במחשבה הפוליטית המודרנית, וכן את התפיסה המבחינה בין שלושת הכתרים, כתר כהונה, כתר מלוכה, כתר תורה, שתרמה לעיקרון הפרדת הרשויות. פרופסור אריק נלסון מהרווארד בספרו The Hebrew Republic הוכיח את ההשפעה של התנ"ך והתלמוד על החשיבה של הוגי המשפט הבינלאומי והמחשבה הפוליטית, כמו הוגו גרוטיוס, ג'ון לוק, ג'ון סלדן ותומאס הובס. ולאחרונה פרסם פרופסור דיוויד פלייטו מהאוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים ספר מרתק ופורץ דרך שיצא בהוצאת הספרים של אוניברסיטת הרווארד על שלטון החוק והפרדת הרשויות ביהדות בכלל ובמשפט העברי בפרט, החל מתקופת התנ"ך ובעיקר בתקופת המשנה.
And Professor Herzog actually proceeded to discuss certain aspects of my own writings for the next 30 or so seconds, which was obviously a thrilling personal moment for me, but shows what a special country Israel is. That a president understands that when we think about the destiny and the role and even the legal system in Israel, we can't just think about its democratic foundations, but also, of course, about its Jewish foundations, from the Bible through the rabbis, all the way through the great traditions that developed in the diaspora up until the modern state. And for me, it showed how even in my own little efforts, everybody needs to contribute to this discourse and try to have its skin in the game, to make sure, we all have skin in the game, to make sure that this moment, this tense moment in the Jewish story is navigated out of its messy and dangerous terrain into a successful resolution. What I want to try to do this evening is to try to give a little bit more background about this controversy. There are different dimensions to this controversy. What I won't do is discuss what is certainly critical, the social dimensions, the social fissures, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi, the religious and the secular, those who are more the liberal elite, and those who are from different backgrounds and onward. Those are critical issues, and of course, Jews and Arabs, Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. All of that is crucial background, but that takes a lot of time to discuss, and I know many people here are well read about that, but hopefully we'll have other opportunities to talk about that. There are, of course, political dimensions to what are going on, right versus left, which I'll just touch on briefly. But what I really want to do is talk about its legal dimension, which is certainly only a piece in the puzzle, and many think that's a small piece in the puzzle that is mass larger social and political issues, and that might be correct. But still, tonight, let's talk about some of the legal background to what's going on. What you have here is, does anybody know what we have here? A picture of the Israeli Supreme Court. How many in the room have been to the Supreme Court? Okay, a few of you, many more of you have a place to visit next time you're in Jerusalem. I have a feeling this is going to become a more popular place to visit. And you see here the beautiful building of the Supreme Court, relatively new building. And behind you see, of course, the Knesset. And it's no coincidence that they are built in proximity, in relationship to one another. There's a deliberate straight path from the Supreme Court to the Knesset. Of course, for us Americans, it reminds us of the layout of Washington, D.C., and that's no coincidence. There's a certain deliberate architectural design going here, that the different pillars of government should be in a dialectic, but also in conversation with one another. That's an institutional element of what's going on. What are the relationships between these institutions? Parliament, the cabinet, and also the judiciary. But of course, there are also personalities. We've already mentioned the legendary Bibi Netanyahu. It's remarkable to think that Bibi Netanyahu has been prime minister in Israel in about 15 years. Of course, in the US, that can no longer be possible due to amendments that have precluded that possibility. But in Israel, this is the larger-than-life figure. And of course, such a polarizing figure to half the country about he is King Bibi, the legendary, the one and only, the only true politician of Israel. And to the others, they have other adjectives. We saw what some people in Tel Aviv think about Bibi Netanyahu. And here you have perhaps a lesser-known figure here on the left. You have Esther Chayut. Esther Chayut, who is the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, only until this fall, because there's mandatory retirement in Israel at age 70. Interesting issue to think about. Well, we think about that here in America, but in Israel, that's the system. And she has been surprisingly vocal. In January, she gave a speech criticizing the reform, which we know in America is something that justices rarely would do, speak out about politics, and in Israel too. But no doubt she felt that she had to speak. And you see here the two of them are sitting near each other, and Netanyahu's relationship to the judiciary is actually a complicated one. If you follow his career, there are points. There were tensions in the 90s. There are points they were close in the 2000s. And now there's been a lot of tension, especially since Bibi got more and more involved in, or deep in legal problems of his own, being indicted on several grounds. So there's certainly personal stake, not just institutional stake. And that's probably always true in relationship between branches of government. We have the abstract branches, and then we have the personalities who inhabit, and they navigate and configure their dynamics. So all of that is true in Israel's case too. And this is the background, the most general level of what's going on now, trying to figure out the relationship between the institutions and also between the personalities, which has led to Bibi and his government introducing a series of reforms, and Chayut and many others, especially among the camp of the jurists, who are strongly opposed to the idea of judicial reform. Now, I want us to just briefly make a comparative point here in the US. In the US, we know there are also interesting relationships between the different branches, captured in this picture in a brief way. Here we have the different institutions, but we also, of course, know different personalities. And different figures at various points have had complicated or vexed relationship between the different branches, including the executive, the president, and the judiciary. On the bottom right, Nixon, and on the top left, President Trump, that every day we need to hit refresh on the news just to figure out where things are at between the judiciary and the 45th president. And of course, the 46th president also has his challenges now with the special counsel. So in the US, we also, of course, have these dynamics, and they're complicated and tense. And interestingly, in the US, there's also been talk about judicial reform. Here we have a picture of scholars. They're on Zoom, in case you forgot what this is. And here they're raising their hands because they're taking a pledge. They're official members of Biden's Judicial Reform Commission. But we don't really hear about them. Law professors know about this. Maybe those who are real court watchers know that there's such a commission, but they really have not made much of an impact in the US. And it's worth just briefly commenting on that difference. How come in the US there's discussion about judicial reform and nobody's marching out into the streets, and in Israel, of course, the very opposite reaction? But the answer is obvious. This is an academic commission, which is tapped by the president, that is likely going to lead to a lot of such commissions. Results, nada, nothing. So it's a theoretical discussion, maybe important to have in theory, but nothing practically is happening. But in Israel, of course, the judicial reforms that are been introduced are not theory. Now some of them are reality, and they are coming down the pike at a very fast pace, and Israelis understand this well, and that's part of why there's been such an outcry and such a reaction. And by the way, even in New York, we have challenges about the court. I'll leave those for another time. So I want to learn more about Israel and its relationship, its judiciary, its constitutional status. And here I have a question mark, Israel and a constitution. So I'm going to pose that question to everybody here in a minute. But first, let me pose a more basic question. What is a constitution? That's a basic civic question, and maybe I'm giving a bit of an elementary response. But still, let's briefly try to define what a constitution is, and then we could address, does Israel have a constitution, which I think is critical as backdrop to understanding what's going on in Israel. So any thoughts? What is a constitution in its most basic sense? Anybody want to?
Fundamental body of laws.
A fundamental body of laws. And what do those laws do?
Apply to everybody.
They apply to everybody. Any other thoughts?
They set up, not only the separation of powers, but also a balance of powers.
Okay, they set up the role of the government, so they establish and delimit the government's powers. And what else is usually in a constitution?
Well, the Constitution basically is set up, it's a framework that is set up.
By the way, this is a ringer. This is a pro over here. Yeah. Go ahead.
It sets up a framework which encompasses how the society will be run and cannot be changed by normal legislation.
Okay, and which impacting for sure, excellent, and impacting also all the citizens. So often constitutions define the basic rights of citizens, okay? So they enshrine fundamental rights of citizens. I would say at the most general level, this is a definition of the Constitution. I know we have some jurists here and political theorists and practitioners, though maybe there are different forms of constitution, but I think at the most basic level, this is a definition. Or maybe we could give a more colloquial answer. The Constitution sets out the rules of the game of governance. Who can govern, what's the scope of governing, and what are the limits of governing, especially vis-a-vis citizens. So now I want to turn to the question, does Israel have a constitution? No. So everybody's saying no. Any yeses? A lot of no's.
Have the Declaration of
Okay, so there are mostly yeses and a few caveats. So I think that's pretty fair, but let's follow along and let's learn a little bit more about the Constitution, or review for those who know. So here we have a famous picture of Ben Gurion. Of course, we know the date, Yom Ha'atzmaut, the first Yom Ha'atzmaut, May 14th, 1948. Which city is this in? Tel Aviv. I imagine many of you have visited on Rothschild Street, Constitutional Hall, and here we have Ben Gurion sitting under the portrait of Herzl. And he's reading the Declaration of Independence. And in that Declaration of Independence, which was actually necessitated by the 1947 Partition Plan and UN Resolution 181. So in that partition plan, there was a necessity for each state, and of course, it's only Israel that followed this plan, to set out and set up a state, declare the basic laws of the state, and to also include one other provision, which is in Israel's Declaration of Independence. By the way, this Declaration of Independence probably was well known in the early years of the state. I think over time it was less well known, but today it's all over Israel. And you could walk around, especially in Tel Aviv, and you see large banners of the Declaration of Independence. I think that's a confluence of the 75th year and, of course, what's going on. And you see it in the municipality, a long, unfurled Declaration of Independence. And in that Declaration of Independence, we have the following surprising lines. If you're unfamiliar, and if you're familiar, they're still surprising. It says that we hereby declare that as from the termination of the mandate at midnight, this night of the 14th, to the 15th of May 48, and until the setting up of duly elected bodies of the state, in accordance with a constitution, to be drawn up by a constituent assembly not later than the first day of October 1948. So the Declaration of Independence explicitly says that a constitution will be enacted, and it says a due date, October 48. So when I teach in Israel and a student does not hand something in on time, I guess they have a pretty good excuse, because the entire country is 75 years late on its own deadline that it put in ink on its first night. So there you have it. They're supposed to set up a constitution, and through a constituent assembly, an assembly that is going to compose the Constitution. Now, this did not happen. And it's an interesting question why it did not happen. There were attempts at writing a constitution. There are various drafts of written constitutions, including by one Leo Cohn, that maybe we'll return to at the very end. But over the first couple of years, things got more contested, surprise, surprise, and Israeli society had different views about whether there should be a constitution, notwithstanding what was stated explicitly in the Declaration of Independence. There were various opponents to the Constitution. One group of opponents were ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they opposed the idea, and in some formulations they said, what do you mean a constitution? The Torah is our constitution. Interestingly, religious Zionists did not share this viewpoint, and religious Zionists were involved in the effort to write a constitution. But then you had these two mythical figures, Ben Gurion, the first prime minister, who we already mentioned, and Menachem Begin, who eventually will become a prime minister, and another legendary figure in Israel. And they really were in loggerheads about the idea of a constitution. Who among the two was opposed to a constitution? So that everybody here is well read, which is great, but it is a little of a twist from our modern perspective, who's actually Ben Gurion, who was opposed to the idea of having a constitution. Now, we just saw him read from the Declaration of Independence, where he explicitly said that by October 48, there will be a constitution. I guess it's hard to know what he was thinking on May 14th, but quickly he soured on the idea. And there seem to be various reasons he opposed the idea of the Constitution. Some of the reasons attributed to him are, first of all, it's just too soon. It's hard to know how to write a constitution that will be apt for this country that's just figuring out its identity. Moreover, there was great migration or immigration into Israel. We know in the early 50s, a lot of the Jews from the Mizrahi countries, from the Arab countries, were coming to Israel. And indeed, the demography of Israel changed dramatically over its opening years. Moreover, Ben-Gurion said, we have enough tsaras to deal with. We're fighting a war. We're trying to figure out our economy. We're just getting over the Holocaust. We just don't have the stability to establish a constitution. And lastly, it seems that Ben-Gurion just didn't want his hands tied. He and the Mapai that dominated early politics had a strong socialistic vision of the country and had a political roadmap, and they didn't want a constitution to limit them. Now, if we think about their reasons, I think that one of too soon is an interesting one. What's the right time to write a constitution? We're used to what we did in America, where we tried to do it very early on, actually flopping with the Articles of Confederation, but then by the late 1780s succeeding and writing a constitution very early on that remarkably has lasted, and even though being challenged in all sorts of ways, continues to live on and to guide Americans, hopefully for a long, long time. In Israel, at least the theory was, how could you set in stone a constitution early on? And there's something to that argument, I think, in a political theory sense. Maybe a more mature country can formulate its constitution in a better way. But of course, it also might be kicking the can down the road and avoiding all the knotty and sometimes seemingly intractable issues about how to lay the cornerstones to govern Israeli society, which of course are coming to a head 75 years in. Interestingly, Begin was for a constitution. The party today called Likud was called Cherut, and Cherut means liberty. And one of its most basic commitments was to liberty, including basic liberties in a constitution. And that was Begin's attitude, at least when he was in the opposition. Once he was a governing party, he spoke less about the need for a constitution. So realpolitik might play a lot into things in Israel, in the US, about these types of questions. So what happened? Early on, they're supposed to write a constitution, and they have this major debate, and they're paralyzed. Are they writing a constitution? Are they not? They're drafts, but nobody's agreeing on them. And here we have a resolution that's become well known as the Harari Resolution. Harari was an MK in the early Knesset, and he proposed the following idea attributed to him, which is indeed what won the day. His idea was that the first Knesset instructs, so instead of being a constituent assembly, it's calling itself a Knesset. It's a legislator, but it'll instruct a committee. This is a committee we read about today that Simcha Rothman runs today. So it instructs a new committee called the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee to prepare a draft state constitution. The constitution will be built chapter by chapter in such a way that each will constitute a separate basic law. It's an interesting idea. The idea is, let's say you're overwhelmed with a project. You're trying to write a book, and you're stuck on the introduction, and you're paralyzed, and it's overwhelming. So rather, a good pedagogic technique would be, rather than thinking about writing a book, in a self-help book, maybe they'll tell you to do something like this, try to break it down into subparts, think about units, think about sections, think about chapters, work at one at a time in a serial sense, and then over time, you'll gather what you have, and that will be your constitution. So that was the idea. Let's have the constitution accumulate piecemeal through basic laws. The idea of basic laws actually is a German legal concept, and it's interesting to think of German jurisprudence influencing Israeli constitutional thinking, but no doubt it did, along with British thinking and other Anglo thinking. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So the idea was, rather than having a constitution where there's no consensus, let's do it piece by piece through basic laws. Did this happen? The answer is not really in the year 1950, but slowly this did start to happen, that the Israeli Knesset, that same legislator, apparently wearing a different hat, although it's the same legislator, started to pass basic laws. The first basic law is in 1958, and they go on all the way to present times. All in all, Israel has 13 basic laws. And if you think about what are they doing, most of them are dealing with that first circle that we saw, establishing government and delimiting the scope of governmental power. So here we have basic laws establishing the legislator and the office of the president, and also the executive, the cabinet, and other parts of the government, including the judiciary. By the way, the years are not formal parts of these laws, because in theory, these are not tied to a specific year. These are part of an accumulating series or set of basic laws. Now, all of these deal with the government, that first circle, the powers of the government, but not with fundamental rights, individual rights, civil liberties. We hear nothing about that, or almost nothing about that, in the basic laws except voting rights, until the year 1992. And in 1992, this is about 40 or so years into the history of the country of Israel, suddenly the plot thickens in potentially a dramatic way. Because finally, there's consensus around passing a basic law that deals with fundamental rights, known in Hebrew as Kvod Ha'adam V'Cheruto, or in English, human dignity and liberty. Now, this is interesting because it is a dramatic moment in Israel that various parties somehow were willing to agree, including parties on the right. Actually, Dan Meridor from Likud was influential and active in writing these laws. Parties on the left, religious parties, found ways to compromise. It's a lesson for our times. They didn't aim as high as some wanted, but they found agreement about these things, human dignity and liberty, and they passed these laws. It also didn't get much press, which is surprising. Part of the reason was it was at the very end of a coalition of Shamir. They were heading into elections, and they also were changing the election system in Israel to vote directly for the prime minister. That's not how it works today, but there were about 7 years in Israel where there was direct voting for the prime minister. So all the press and all the debate focused on that, and under the radar, this basic law passed. And then a new government, the Rabin government, and we think of about 93, the Rabin government and Oslo, that's what happened right after. But this is a big deal, potentially at least. This says the basic human rights in Israel are based on the recognition of the value of the human being, sanctity of life, being a free person, etc. And then look at the purpose. By the way, cross-references the Declaration of Israel, even in the top paragraph. And then in the purpose, Paragraph 1, the purpose of this basic law is to protect human dignity and liberty in order to embed the values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. That's a very famous formula. That's where the formula is found. So there's a lot going on here, and I'm trying to say it briefly, but Google it and read it. But here we have enshrined liberty. Individual liberty is protected. And the government cannot trample on individual liberty or cannot legislate in ways that encroach on individual liberty, at least not in ordinary circumstances. There's actually one other provision I just want to point to, and that's Provision 8. Provision 8 I just brought a little bit, But what provision 8 says, one is not to violate the rights accorded by this basic law. You can't violate liberty, save by means of a law that corresponds to the values of State of Israel, etc. And the etc. is important, but a bit technical. What it's saying is that the government cannot legislate in a way that encroaches on an individual's liberty unless there are really good reasons. In America, we'd call, I'll use legalese for a second, it has to pass a strict scrutiny test. And there's something along these lines going on here. Meaning, the government cannot pass a law unless it's really important if the law infringes on individual liberties. But the question is, who figures out whether the law passes that test? Usually, strict scrutiny is going to necessitate an arbiter to decide whether the government has passed the test to pass a law to limit liberties for a good enough reason. So this seems to be inviting the court in to do judicial review. Okay, so here we have the basic laws that now not only establish government, but also include individual rights, including protection of liberty, and it seems to tap the court with responsibility to monitor or supervise whether the government is within bounds or out of bounds. That, at least, is the way this another epic figure in Israeli society understood things. Here we have Aaron Barak, who was Attorney General of Israel, professor at Hebrew University, the youngest tenured professor at Hebrew University, and eventually, most famously, not just a Supreme Court justice, but the most controversial Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court. And I would say he too is a polarizing figure. For about half the country, or maybe a bit less than half, I'm not saying it's statistically exact, but for many, he is a legendary figure, the greatest jurist that Israel ever had, the one who was most proactive in developing Israel's legal system and constitutional system. And for others, he is the great usurper of power, the one who ran with a mandate that wasn't his and transformed the landscape of Israel's legal system without authority. Now, the way Barak did this was through numerous decisions, but here we'll simplify. Barak, in his own words, described the 1992 law as the culmination of and the moment of a constitutional revolution. And Barak, in a case in the year 1995 called Bank Mizrahi, wrote a about 300-page opinion, along with another justice, cumulatively a 500-page judicial opinion. Now, when you're dealing with a legal matter, you don't need 500 pages. But Barak understood that this was a turning point, and he was going to guarantee that this was a turning point in Israel's legal system. So cumulatively writing 500 pages, making the following, I'm going to simplify, argument. His argument was, it's true that Israel up front did not write a constitution, but it committed to writing a constitution. And the compromise was to formulate a constitution gradually through basic laws. After 40 or so years, we have the cumulative 13 basic laws. And here we have most of the elements of the Constitution. So here we have it. It has arrived finally after 40 years, the Constitution. It does what a Constitution needs to do. It establishes the different seats of government. It demarcates and draws the contours of their different powers, and it also establishes fundamental rights, human dignity, and liberty, enshrining them. And it taps the Supreme Court with authority to have judicial review to ensure that the government, both through governmental action and the legislator through laws, abides by the constitution of the basic laws, including individual rights and including liberty. So argued Barak. and Barak had most of the justices on his side. Now, there was a counter voice on the court, a very brilliant justice named Cheshen. And Cheshen rejected this argument in strong terms. And here is some of what Cheshen argued. He said, I never heard of a constitution sneaking through the door quietly and suddenly arriving without any fanfare. Isn't a constitution something that's supposed to be announced loud and clear? Shouldn't there be a convention? Shouldn't it be taken to the people? Shouldn't they know what's at stake and decide whether this is the constitution they want to live by? Cheshen, who was not a religious man, but was learned and brilliant, cited the Decalogue. And he said, look how the Decalogue begins. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. God announces, I am here, and these are your laws. That's the way a legal system is supposed to operate. It's supposed to be clear who is the sovereign and what are the laws. And it cannot sneak through the back door. That is not constitutional. That doesn't have the dignity of a constitution. Another professor who I had the privilege to know personally, who passed away too young, Ruth Gavizon, also argued that this approach of a piecemeal constitution is problematic because you don't have the entirety presented to then deliberate about, does this work together? Do the different parts fit together? Do we strike the right balances and the right compromises of a constitution? So all of those are necessary. So I'm trying to present as best I can both sides. I think there's much to Barak's argument, and there's much to the criticism of Barak. I'm going to hold on the comments just because I want to keep going at the end. I would love to hear them. Barak, though, of course, was in the driver's seat. He's the Chief Justice, and he has a consensus on the court. And Barak doesn't just go with the idea that Israel has a constitution. Just to give Barak's answer to the question I posed, does Israel have a constitution? Everybody here in the room more or less said no, but Barak's answer is yes, it does. It has a cumulative basic laws that have all the elements of a constitution, including judicial review. Israel does, 40 years into its history, have a constitution which it's bound by. And then Barak went further. And he did, it's not just him, but it's easier to describe it. Maybe it's problematic to ascribe it all to him, but just for simplicity's sake, him and the justices, especially in the 80s and 90s, made more transformations. They expanded the role of the court. They took the doctrine of standing, which again is a bit technical, but in the U.S., to appear before the court, you have to prove that you're a party that's affected, that you have an injury in fact. In Israel, there's a real dilution. Basically, any citizen could petition the court about constitutional matters. It diluted the notion of a political question doctrine, which is the court only could deal with legal issues, not political matters. That's the constitutional rules in America, and in Israel, much less so. The court can get involved in the business of the government, in gas deals, in the business of the army, in the business of immigrants, and onward. The court has established broad jurisdiction for itself. Barak also and the court read liberty in an expansive way. In the U.S., of course, we have a Bill of Rights with 8 Bill of Rights or 10 Bill of Rights. In Israel, you have 1. So the court started reading into liberty that liberty also encompasses equality and also encompasses freedom of speech and also encompasses freedom of religion. So they read all of that into liberty. Now, again, I think we could understand both sides. Barak was saying liberty is very vague. You have to start to fill out what it means. And which liberal country doesn't have protection of basic liberties like equality, like freedom of speech, and onward? But the opponents were saying you're taking one provision and inflating and expanding it, even though nobody has authorized you to do that. So all of this, of course, was very controversial. but it's what made the court such a central institution in Israel and a real balance to the other branches of government. Now, what explains this growth of the court, this meteoric rise of the court in the 80s and 90s? We could try to understand it internally, but can we understand it, through social factors or political factors? So here, let me just briefly cite two explanations that are often referred to. One is by Professor at Tel Aviv, Meni Mountner, who points out that the following is important background. Ben-Gurion and the Mapai dominated, the liberal camp dominated Israeli politics for the opening decades, and there really was no other player on the map. And then, in a shocking turn of events, you have this picture that is worth more than 1,000 words in Israeli political history. You have the shocking swing to Begin and to Cherut, where the right stunned the left and won a victory in 1977. But this wasn't just a shift in 1977. If we go from 1977 to 2023, the right has dominated Israeli politics. Of course, there are moments where the left was empowered, including Oslo and Rabin. But largely, there's been a shift from 77 on, from the left to the right. And the argument of Mountner is, now that the left lost the parliament and lost the executive, lost the cabinet, the left held on to the one branch it could hold on to, which is the court, and it inflated and expanded the powers of the court. And there are parallels to this in American political history. That's the argument of Mountner. I think there's another argument, there are probably numerous, but another one I want to share from the historian Anita Shapira, also of Tel Aviv. Shapira points to certain cultural changes in Israeli society in the late 70s, 80s, into the 90s. She talks about how Israel, and these are generalizations, but I think they hold true as generalizations, was originally in its ethos collectivist, and it became more individualistic over time. And a more individualistic society is more focused on individual rights and on individual liberties. There also was, in the early decades, more reverence for the state. I think there was more of a sense of the miracle of pulling off a state, and a sense of commitment to the state, and deference to the state to guide the people through such a difficult landscape. And things began to change where people started to become more vocal in their criticism of the state. Perhaps this changes with a debacle politically and in a military sense too of the Yom Kippur War. This certainly led to more vocal criticism, to a more active journalism, to a freer press. And also a freer press is, so what's the point? How does this link to the judiciary? It links to the judiciary because who's gonna react to the state, check the state, limit the state? Or if we think about the press, who's gonna protect the freedoms of the press? And a third cultural or social change that Shapira points to that I think is important is the role of America. Early on, the country perhaps looked more to England, to European models, but certainly over time in the 80s, and you felt this visiting Israel, America and its ways became more dominant, which I think leads to an influence of things like individual liberty, and also the role of the court in America. By the 60s, the court is much stronger. So in the 80s, Israel's imitating America. So for all these reasons, perhaps this gives us more context to understand the shifting role of the court. And the court indeed became more powerful in the 80s, into the 90s, and up until this day, which leads to our current moment. That's the context of our current moment. So here I just want to briefly talk about what's going on in the current moment. And here I'll be brief because I know everybody's reading about it in the news. In the proposals trying to now check the judiciary and limit the judiciary, coming now from the right at this point. Again, there's certain ironies. The party of Begin that was pro the court, and even Bibi that was pro the independence of the court, now has become much more critical of the court for various reasons that I won't go into now, but we could try to sketch some of them. But either way, they think the court has gone off the rails and has to be constricted. And they have a whole roadmap of how to do this, and they have certain different ideas. I'll skip the first two, even though those are important and controversial, but at least as of now, they're more in the background. It's giving the way a Knesset could override the court. It's changing the role of the Attorney General or of different legal advisors. But then we have the third and fourth. So let's just briefly talk about the third, and then we'll get to the fourth. The third is to change the judicial selection method that no doubt you've read about, but let's just briefly review this. In Israel, how do we appoint Supreme Court justices or judges beyond that? But let's talk about the Supreme Court. So you have a committee. You see here they're wearing masks. This is recent. And you have a committee comprised of 9 individuals. And in the 9 individuals, you'll see that the first 2 are politicians, and the last 3 and 4 are 3 Supreme Court justices, and then 2 members of the Israeli bar. So basically, you have 2 plus 2, 4 politicians, and 3 plus 2, 5 jurists. So you have a majority of jurists. So this is not the American system, right? In the American system, of course, we know we have the Article 2 executive that nominates, and then from Article 1, the Senate confirms. That's the American system. In Israel, it's a totally different system since 1953 for a long time. And the system is you have a committee, 5 jurists, 4 politicians. So the majority are jurists, and the jurists tend to sort of be aligned ideologically. That has been the tendency. And they tend to be more left-leaning, more progressive, more secular. That is their tendency. While we saw that politicians tend to be more and more from the right camp. So that's what disturbs the coalition, Bibi, Rothman, Levine, and the right. They think this committee has to change, that it is majority of politicians and the jurists to be in minority. Just a little footnote, the system today is not just a strict majority. You actually need 7 out of the 9 to agree. So there needs to actually be some common ground today. It's not so simple to just have the 5 jurists say, this is who we want, because they need to convince 2 politicians to go with them. That's been the system since 2008, an important amendment to the system. So some of the argument of the right is, why should we do it this way? Who else does it this way? America does it in a different way. The political branch selects the judges. Why shouldn't that be the system in Israel? That's the argument. I think we could think of responses to that argument. One response is, well, how well is the American system working? That, I think, is a fair question to ask of late. Of all the things to borrow from America, is this the one to borrow? Question. The other argument is a more basic structural argument, and that is, this is a bit of an intense map, but what it captures is the basic design of government, which is that you see sort of everything is interconnected. You basically have Article 1, the legislator, and Article 2, the executive, but they're interconnected. And it tends to be that the cabinet comes from the coalition, from the legislature. That's almost always the case. So today, the Knesset, 64 out of 120, lean right, and then the executive comes from within those 64, and they comprise the prime minister and the cabinet. So Article 1 and Article 2 are in concert usually. So then who is a check on this system. In other words, rather than having a diffused and separated system like exists in America, which has its own challenges, but still in America, there are all sorts of separation. Horizontal separation, 3 different branches. Within Article 1, bicameralism. Of course, there's the constitutional arrangement. That's the system in America, and Israel lacks all of this. It's debatable whether it has a constitution. Certainly, there's not consensus about a constitution. There's no bicameralism, and the executive and legislative go together. And now, if the judiciary is going to become politicized, that means all the branches will go in one direction, which is very concerning to those who are against the reform. So that's about judicial appointments. Now here's a picture of what happened when the government, of course, tried to push through its amendments. This led to a very tense moment. Gallant, the defense minister, resigned briefly, then got reappointed. Bibi did a pause on the reforms. But now we know that in the last month, of course, the government has picked up the reforms and has not just in theory now, but passed one of the reforms, and that is the final reform I have here, the reasonableness. I see the hour is late. I won't get into it, but if anybody wants to discuss that afterwards. The basic idea is that one of the tools that the court developed to review the executive branch, the administrative state in Israel, is to say that if the government's actions are extremely unreasonable, then they are illegal. And now the court, the legislature has passed a basic law, and the basic law now says that the court can no longer decide that something is extremely unreasonable. I don't want to lose everybody here in the last minute, so let me just say it again. The court had a tool to review the government action, saying if it's extremely unreasonable, it's illegal. And now the Knesset, the coalition of 64, has passed a basic law saying the court can no longer use that tool. Simplifying, that's what's happened. And in certain circumstances. I said I'm generalizing, but Izzy's right, in certain circumstances. I am simplifying throughout tonight. And that is, just give me 1 second. I'm happy to hear the comments, but let me just give the simplified version. And I know there's some problems with simplifying, but I want to finish the narrative, and then I'm happy to try to get into more resolution or to learn from your comments. Here you have the picture of them passing, sort of a controversial picture, that Levine and the coalition of 64 were elated that they finally took some of their plan and actually passed it 64 to 0 because the remaining members abstained and left the Knesset and didn't even vote. So this is the law right now. But in September, on September 12th, the Supreme Court in Bank, a full panel, unprecedented in Israel, is going to review this basic law. Now that is pretty odd to us because, and here's where things get a little bit subtle and ironic, but this is the way things are. The basic law, according to the court, is a constitution. So it's odd for the court to review the Constitution. That seems odd. The Constitution is the Constitution and it has to guide the court. But the court's argument potentially is, well, if there are going to be changes to the Constitution, we have to make sure that the changes, the updates to the Constitution, like changing the role of the court, adheres and is consistent with the entirety of the Constitution. And then the court may have almost an opposite type of an argument that at the end of the day, listen, these basic laws are just passed by a regular Knesset, so we could review it. Now that's sort of like problematic because it's almost paradoxical. But either way, leaving the theories of it, it's a very dramatic moment. There's been a change to the constitutional landscape, quote unquote, and the court is going to review whether that change, in the opinion of the court, is a valid change or a not valid change. And this has the potential for what is called a constitutional crisis. And the idea of a constitutional crisis is what you see over here. a constitutional crisis, let's think in America, you have a constitution, and sorry for the silly cartoon, but it captures it well, that every branch of government is saying, I know what the Constitution means. Congress says it knows what the Constitution means. The court says it knows what the Constitution means. And the president says that the president knows what the Constitution means. And it goes around in circles, and nobody agrees where the buck stops. If that would happen, that would be a constitutional crisis. In America, the buck has stopped here for a long, long time. That the ultimate word is the court. And that's the question, what will happen in Israel? If the court says that the change now that was passed is inconsistent with the rest of the basic laws and hence unconstitutional, will the two branches of the Knesset and of the cabinet agree with the court, abide by the court, or disagree with the court? And potentially that could lead to all sorts of very, very dispiriting scenarios about not knowing who to listen to, who's in charge, who does the military listen to, who does the police listen to. That could get very sad and difficult. I want to just wrap up with a more inspiring point. And the more inspiring point is, rather than think about all the bad places things could spiral, let's think for a moment, the way we began, of what's at stake. And the stake and the commitment and the passion. And I do think we should not lose sight of that. And to see the spirit of Israelis, how they care about the fate of Israel, and us Jews care about the fate of Israel, and care that Israel is a just society. It's right there in Israeli Declaration of Independence. Its commitment to freedom, cherut, meaning liberty, and to justice, to tzedek. And those are grounded not just in Western values, but as it says in the Declaration of Independence, they are grounded in the vision of the prophets of Israel. This is an enduring commitment of the Jewish people to be a people of justice. That's our DNA, and that's what's at stake in Israel, people caring about fulfilling this vision of making Zion the ultimate seat of justice, and lively, impassioned, spirited, hopefully, ultimately constructive debates about what justice means. I'll just conclude and then I'll stop because the hour is late, but anybody who wants to add comments or questions, I will stick around. In the year 1948, a constitution was drafted, not enacted, by Leo Cohen. Leo Cohen was born in Germany and immigrated to Israel, spent a few years in Ireland and Dublin learning from its constitutional arrangement, and then came to Israel and served in the Jewish Agency. And you could imagine the moment of this German-born Jew right after the Holocaust being in Israel and being tapped with formulating a constitution. And he began with the words, "We, the children of Israel," no doubt looking across the Atlantic to "we, the people of the United States," and formulated, "We, the children of Israel." But then the next turn, he veers from the U.S. Constitution, turning to God, giving praise and thanks to God. And then he talks about what the Jewish people have been through to pull off this miracle of a state, being delivered from bondage to freedom, and then referring in the continuation to the sacrifices, moving language of the korbanot, the sacrifices in Jewish lives to make it through, to come to the state of Israel, to have an independent state. And that is what's at stake in the land of Israel, to find a way after all the counted sacrifices, in order that the ember of Jacob not be extinguished. And we resolve to establish our state on the pillars of peace and justice according to the vision of the prophets of Israel. These words ring true 75 years in. It's easy for us to watch and not to understand or be gravely concerned. We should be concerned. We should be invested. But we should not lose sight of the great miracle of the state of Israel, of the contrast of where the Jews were before and what they achieved by arriving, and of their enduring commitment from that early 1948 through 75 years to make sure Israel is a society that is a beacon of justice for Jewish people and for the entire world. Thank you. Whoever needs to leave, please leave. I'll stick around for those who have comments and questions. Izzy. Yeah.